his nose.
This is an NBC News special report. Here's Tom Yamas.
And good afternoon. We are coming on the air with breaking news right now from Alaska, a high-stakes moment on the world stage. Right now, we are expecting President Trump on board Air Force One on the tarmac there at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, just a few miles away from where we are here in Anchorage, to get down, walk down from Air Force One. At any moment now, we also expect later to see Russian President Vladimir Putin when his plane lands as well at that base. The president is expected to greet Putin with a real red carpet arrival, and we have actually seen that red carpet. It has been rolled out already. Today's meeting is a historic one, marking the first time Putin has stepped foot on U.S. soil in about a decade, and the first time they have met in person since President Trump returned to the White House. Now, the president's goal to pave the way for a potential ceasefire and a deal that would end the war in Ukraine, which began with Russia's invasion 3 years ago. Putin praised the president's peace efforts in recent days, calling them energetic and sincere, but Putin has not signaled movement towards a potential ceasefire. Notably missing from today's summit, of course, Ukraine's President Zelensky. Soon we expect to show you the start of the face-to-face meeting between Putin and President Trump. Again, we are still awaiting President Trump to walk down there from Air Force One and deplane. They are going to have a lunch after that meeting with their expanded delegations, and once the meeting ends, there's potentially a joint news conference with the two leaders. It's still unclear if they're going to take questions. Now, some things have already changed in real time, and we have some new reporting. Garrett Hake from our White House unit joins us now live here in Anchorage. Garrett, you were just telling me literally seconds ago, this bilateral meeting now can no longer be called a bilateral meeting technically?
That's right. These summits are highly choreographed affairs, and already the first steps in this summit will be changing. The president will now be joined in his first meeting with Vladimir Putin by Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Marco Rubio, and by his special envoy Steve Witkoff, who was the intermediary who set up this meeting in the first place. I think it speaks to kind of the ad hoc nature of this summit and the speed with which it was all put together. The president also on the flight over, Tom, saying that his goal is still to try to secure a ceasefire quickly, if not in this meeting, he says, hopefully very soon thereafter. That's notable, too, because the White House has spent most of the last week lowering expectations for this meeting, suggesting the most important thing that would come out of it would be another meeting, one that involves Ukrainian President Zelensky. But now you hear the president again saying if this doesn't happen today, that there would be some kind of ceasefire agreement, he'd be particularly upset, Tom.
And you're reporting, along with our other correspondents at the White House, he has sort of lowered the bar, right? Yeah. Lowered the expectations. He's saying he's not coming out of here with a land swap deal or even a ceasefire deal. It's to set the table, in his words, for another meeting. What exactly does that mean? Is the ultimate goal, as the White House sees it right now, to maybe get a meeting where you get all three leaders together?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the president has come around to the idea that you can't get to a peace deal about Ukraine without Ukraine. That's something that the Ukrainians and the Europeans have been insistent upon and for some time quite worried about, the idea that President Trump might be more willing to strike a peace deal than the Ukrainians themselves, and that he might strike a deal that the Ukrainians can't stomach. The president had assured the Ukrainians and the Europeans in an earlier meeting this week that he wouldn't be making land swap agreements without the Ukrainians in the room. President Putin has pushed back on the idea of having a meeting with Zelensky. That's something that Trump very much wants. It's something that Zelensky very much wants. I don't think anybody who is looking at this conflict seriously thinks that there could be a ceasefire or any longer-lasting peace agreement without that meeting ultimately taking place.
Garrett, stand by for us. I do want to bring in our chief international correspondent, Richard Engel, who's reporting tonight from Kramatorsk, Ukraine, obviously later there in the day. Richard, we thank you for joining us. The Ukrainians have been very clear, and they've sent a lot of messages to the U.S. They even spoke with President Trump personally this week, and the message has been the same. We know that we're not part of this summit, but please do not be deceived by Vladimir Putin.
That is something that they have been telling me personally, and you hear that from soldiers, you hear that from civilians, you hear that from the Ukrainian government. Don't believe Vladimir Putin. Don't rush into a deal. They know that President Trump is someone who likes to make big deals and big announcements, and they're trying to rein him in. Ukrainians right now are feeling quite powerless as they watch this summit about to happen, and they watch potentially President Trump and Vladimir Putin discuss discussing the future of this country and discussing the future borders of Ukraine, and they are not in the room. Yes, there is this big promise that if it all goes well today, that maybe there will be follow-up summits. We don't know when, we don't know where, that the Ukrainians could be involved in that future meeting. But we know right now an actual meeting in the United States is about to happen, and the Ukrainians aren't there, and it makes them extraordinarily nervous. They're also worried about the way that this is being framed. You and Garrett were just talking a moment ago how President Trump says he won't commit to any land swaps. And Ukrainians ask, what kind of land swaps are you talking about? What happened here is Russia, 3.5 years ago, occupied this country, still occupies about 20%. And what is on the table is how much of that stolen land, occupied land that you're showing in red right now, Russia gets to keep in exchange for promises of not attacking Ukraine any further. There wouldn't be any land swaps. No part of Russia would go to Ukraine. It would only be how much land, stolen land, Vladimir Putin gets to keep for himself and all the people who are in that territory, because this is not just empty spaces. This is not just empty land that could potentially be ceded to Russia. These are Ukrainian towns and cities and homes and villages and sports stadiums, nuclear power plant, huge infrastructure and populations that Ukraine may have to say goodbye to.
As we wait for any moment for President Trump to deplane from Air Force One and set foot there in Elmendorf-Richardson Joint Base, I do want to ask you, Richard, it's a good time to sort of mark some key markers in this war, right? More than 250,000 Russians have died, nearly 1 million casualties on the Russian side, 60 to 100,000 Ukrainians have died. That map you showed there, about 20% of Ukraine is now held by Russia. But when we look at these stats here, we can't say enough about the Ukrainian soldiers, the Ukrainian fighters that have held off Russia, a much bigger country, a country with more money, with more people, and a much larger military, to the point where Russia has now enlisted prisoners to fight on the front lines, to a point now where Russia has gotten North Korea to send in soldiers to fight on their sides. And you've spoken to Ukrainian soldiers who have been blinded in this war, who have vowed to keep fighting.
So, again, very important points that you're raising, and that is what Ukrainians want to stress, that this is not a land swap, that these are not two equal parties who have a dispute over a piece of territory, and now they're getting together to sort it out. 3.5 years ago, Vladimir Putin invaded this country. First, he said he wasn't going to invade, that he was just merely carrying out military exercises, and then launched the biggest land war in Europe since World War II. Ukrainian forces managed to push the Russians back with billions of dollars in military support from the United States, from NATO allies. Ukrainians managed to liberate large parts of their country. But despite all of their fighting and all of the volunteer efforts and their brave resistance, Ukrainians have been unable to dislodge the Russians from this last 20% of the country. And that is the 20% that we're talking about right now. And Ukrainians worry that if today or in a future meeting or in a series of meetings, President Trump effectively gifts that territory to Vladimir Putin in exchange for promises that he won't take more land, Ukrainians don't believe that Vladimir Putin will stop, that he'll be rewarded for that invasion, and that's why they're very nervous. But it doesn't mean that Ukrainians are ready to stop fighting. I spoke to Ukrainian soldiers just the other day, and they say, we can't stop right now. We can't give up, especially at this critical time.
All right, Richard, we thank you as we await again President Trump at any moment to maybe deplane from Air Force One. There was something set in the schedule we were given by the White House that he was going to hold for a moment for 10 minutes before Putin arrives. This may be the hold inside Air Force One. Sometimes these things happen. Sometimes planes land earlier than expected, and sometimes other planes can take longer to arrive. Keir Simmons has been covering Russia for us for a very long time. He had one of the last sit-downs with Vladimir Putin from a Western journalist. Keir, I know you're going to join our coverage now. My question to you is this, Keir. You know, for President Trump, time is really not on his side. He has already said that he could solve this war in a day. It's been 200 since he's elected. He has said that was in jest. He didn't really mean it was going to be a day. But Putin could be in power for another 2 years, another 10 years, maybe for the rest of his life. Time is really on his side. Why do you think he wanted to have this meeting in Alaska today?
Well, Tom, just look at the staging that you're seeing there. Alaska 2025 kind of, platform, Air Force One. For President Putin, this is a win, many Russia watchers believe, because ultimately he's going to stand alongside the U.S. president without any other leaders there, even despite the fact that he invaded Ukraine, that he's been indicted by the International Criminal Court, and that puts him on the world stage in a way that he knows very well, plays well for him in Russia and around the world. I think one of the questions as we look at these pictures, Tom, is what is in President Putin's mind? Tactically, what is he planning? And I'm told by a former Russian official who still has close ties to the Kremlin that don't be surprised if, for example, President Putin comes offering a short ceasefire, maybe an air war ceasefire, maybe a medium-range missile ceasefire of some nature. There is talk that perhaps the Russians will come with some kind of a proposal for a renewal of the New START treaty, the nuclear treaty that it's the Russians who withdrew from some time ago. So it's very likely that even as we are having these conversations, Tom, that the Russians are having similar kinds of conversations behind closed doors. What are the Europeans saying? What are the Ukrainians saying? What does President Trump really want? How can we give him some things that he wants that he can then take and present as a win? Because, and this is the way the Russians may well be thinking, because what we want to do is get to the stage where we can start to have a conversation about lowering sanctions or even restarting trade between Russia and the United States. We want to improve our standing on the world stage, even while we cement relationships with countries like North Korea. The Russians are very, very good at this, and President Putin is coming with very experienced diplomats who know very well the United States. It's interesting, just at the top of the broadcast there, Tom, that you mentioned that President Trump now will be flanked by the Secretary of State and by Steve Witkoff. That makes sense to me, because it's very likely that President Putin will have officials with him who speak fluent English and are prepared and understand exactly what a negotiation with a U.S. administration looks like. And just another point, we've heard from one of those officials saying the U.S. is talking about another meeting. Let's just get this meeting done first.
Keir Simmons first. Keir, also stand by. I do want to bring in former U.S. Ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul. Ambassador, thanks so much for joining our coverage here. I do want to point something out, right? When we first look at the Russian delegation that was announced yesterday by Russia, and we had this on Nightly News, it was announced that Vladimir Putin was coming to Alaska with a very large delegation. You see it right here, along with Sergei Lavrov, all these other ministers, foreign affairs, defense, but also an investment envoy. And then overnight, the delegation for the U.S. seemed to also expand, right? We knew that President Trump was going to come here with Witkoff and with Secretary of State Marco Rubio, but now we know other members of the cabinet are joining as well, including those that deal with the Treasury and Commerce. Are the terms of this meeting maybe a little different in the minds of both leaders? President Trump may want to talk about Ukraine, but Vladimir Putin may want to talk business?
That's exactly my reading of the delegations that they put together. I know every single one of those Russians. I've been in meetings with President Putin and President Obama, and how you staff the meeting drives the agenda. These are all people that want to do deals with the United States. Kirill Dmitriev in particular, he's in charge of direct investment fund inside Russia. Savvy guy, he has degrees from Harvard and Stanford. He wants to talk about business, and it's also important and notable to me who's not in the meeting. Who's not in the meeting is their chief negotiator about ending the war, Mr. Medinsky. He is not part of the delegation. That, to me, sends a very strong signal that Putin wants to expand the aperture. He wants this meeting to be about U.S.-Russian relations in all of its dimensions, not just Ukraine. And I hope the president doesn't fall for that, because I don't think that is in America's national interest. The focus should be Ukraine.
Ambassador McFaul, that's quite a fascinating observation there. So let's sort of expand on that, if we can, as we await President Trump to deplane from Air Force One. If the chief negotiator on the terms of this war is not in this meeting right now, then what do you think a goal is for Putin, and what ultimately is a goal for President Trump here?
Well, Mr. Putin's achieved a lot of his objectives already. The fact that you're in Anchorage, Alaska right now is one of his objectives. This is an extraordinary meeting. The President of the United States, the leader of the free world, the most powerful person in the world, has decided to meet with an indicted war criminal, with somebody who terrorizes Ukraine every single night, as Richard was just explaining, that has kidnapped 20,000 Ukrainian kids. And yet, he gets to stand next to the President of the United States on presidential soil. And the fact that the President is waiting to greet him right now, that is exactly the pomp and circumstance that Putin wants. So it's already a win for him. If nothing else happens, it's an achievement for him. The real question, to me, is what does President Trump get in return for all of those gifts he's already given to Putin? And I think just having another meeting is a pretty small bar to set for such an extraordinary summit. I hope it'll be more than that, but I hope at least it will be that. That is a third meeting that President Zelensky would join.
Ambassador McFaul, since you've had so much experience studying and getting to know Vladimir Putin, I want to read you one of the quotes that we have of him talking about President Trump, basically saying that, in his opinion, Trump is making energetic and sincere efforts to stop the fighting. So that's what Putin said. What did he mean by that?
I think he's right about that, and I applaud the president for being so engaged. But then he leaves out the details about what he says are his terms for a peaceful negotiation. His terms are that Ukrainian soldiers actually leave territories in the eastern part of Ukraine, actually where Richard Engel is right now, Kramatorsk. He wants them to leave voluntarily as part of a ceasefire agreement. And that's a territory that he has not been able to capture since 2014, when he started his first war against Ukraine. And I just think if you think about the absurdity of that position, I think underscores how unlikely it is that Putin actually wants a peace settlement. He thinks time's on his side. He thinks the president will lose interest. He thinks we've already stopped arming the Ukrainians long ago. And he thinks, therefore, that time is on his side. And he welcomes, if President Trump wants to help negotiate an end to this war, but he wants the end of this war on his terms, not on Zelensky's terms.
Ambassador McFaul, always great to have you. I'm sure we're going to check in with you a little later in our coverage. Again, if you're just tuning in, we are waiting for President Trump to deplane Air Force One there at the Joint Base, Elmendorf-Richardson. At some point, we know that he is waiting for President Putin's plane to also arrive there for the start of this historic summit. Our chief White House correspondent, Peter Alexander, is there now live for us today. Peter, I know you're watching all the movements there, and we're sort of in a hold pattern, if you will. If you can, walk our viewers through what we're going to expect over the next coming hours. It's been interesting, right? The Russians sort of came out with a little bit of a surprise, if you will, saying that the meeting, the bilateral, which now has changed, could be up to 7 hours. All of this is very fluid, but we expect at some point to have a news conference and possibly even questions, but that's still unclear.
Yeah, Tom, you're exactly right. So to be clear, Vladimir Putin remains on time. He's still expected to arrive roughly at the top of the hour, 3 o'clock Eastern time, which would be 11 a.m. here. The expectation, the Russians said, is that the President of the United States, Donald Trump, would greet him there at the red carpet as part of a sort of an elaborate ceremony. You can see from the live pictures with the fighter jets on the side, that stage there with Alaska 2025. So I wouldn't be surprised if the president stays on Air Force One until he comes down upon Vladimir Putin's arrival to greet him. Then, as you noted earlier, the biggest change that we have seen so far today is the new expectation. The White House telling me a short time ago that President Trump will no longer be meeting one-on-one with Vladimir Putin, in addition to their interpreters, but he will be joined by his joint envoy, Steve Witkoff, who, of course, is no stranger to Vladimir Putin, the two having just met last week, most recently, as well as the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. The Russian delegation joining President Putin will also be two other individuals, who a 3-on-3 instead of a And then after that expanded bilateral meeting between the two delegations, we have an exact list on who's going to be there. And I was struck by your conversation with Ambassador Mike McFaul there about who's in the room, sort of gives you a sense of what Russia's hoping to accomplish here, not having its negotiator for the war in the room, but other sort of business leaders, top advisors to President Putin. And among those who will be joining Donald Trump in that expanded bilateral lunch meeting, we have now learned are the Secretaries of State, Marco Rubio, of Defense, Pete Hegseth, of Commerce, Howard Lutnick, and the Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent, as well as a couple of other individuals. Susie Wiles, the Chief of Staff to the President, will also be there. So that's where a lot of the rubber meets the road in terms of any broad agreements being made. Of course, it had been some concern of critics, not only that this meeting was taking place with an indicted war criminal, Democrats describing that as a reward in itself for Vladimir Putin, but about what might happen behind closed doors if it was only Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. What, if any, agreements could be made privately between the two, where there are no note takers in the room, only interpreters. It appears that that room will be widening in terms of who will be in attendance. And then ultimately today will be punctuated by a news conference. Whether it is a joint news conference or it is just Donald Trump alone, that remains to be seen. The president says there is a 25% chance of failure. And if today is a failure, he said he'd be glad to come to the cameras behind me alone, a solo news conference, answering questions before departing. And Tom, before we give it back to you, I just want to give you a sense of, you can see the stage behind me. Abe, our cameraman, will push in very quickly. This is where that joint news conference would take place, and perhaps the best indication of what the president is hoping to accomplish, not just here, but going forward. The words written in bold in the middle there, pursuing peace. A senior White House official making very clear that the president arrives here realistic, that this is likely only the beginning of a multi-step process, as they describe it, toward peace. Tom?
All right, Peter Alexander, stand by for us. We appreciate that. I want to bring in Garrett Hake, who's here joining our coverage in Anchorage as well. Garrett, we're getting some new reporting now. We know that President Trump is on Air Force One, and he's having some important meetings, especially with people here in Alaska, the governor and the two Republican senators. Yeah,
that's right. Governor Mike Dunleavy, sort of a stock Republican. Dan Sullivan, the junior senator from Alaska, a Marine veteran himself. Senator Lisa Murkowski, the senior senator from Alaska, probably the single most independent member of the United States Senate. All of them, Tom, I think notably more hawkish on Russia, generally speaking, than the president is. There's been so much reporting over the last decade about the importance of being the last person in President Trump's ear before he makes any big decision. These three Republicans being the last people in the president's ear before this meeting might make some, pro-Ukraine, more hawkish towards Russia folks feel a little bit better going into it.
And it's right. It's a great point. The last person in his ear right before he meets Vladimir Putin. It's interesting because Senator Murkowski, even recently, with a lot of the bills the president has been trying to push through, has really been at odds with the White House.
Yeah, absolutely. She ultimately did vote for that big reconciliation package, the tax and border bill that was such a huge priority for the president, but had a lot of sweeteners in it for Alaska. She was a crucial no vote during the first term on the efforts to repeal Obamacare. Not someone who has a great relationship with this president by any stretch of the imagination, but he is such a transactional figure. I think, at this time in Alaska, any advice, anything that's particularly local to Alaska still might be a useful conversation.
All right, Garrett, hey, great to talk to you. I want to bring in Keir Simmons as well, because he's one of our pseudo-Russian experts, if you will, always our correspondent in Moscow, reporting live from there, able to get in, and again, someone who interviewed Vladimir Putin. Keir, the timing of this meeting is very interesting because recently the president enacted that 50% tariff on India if they continue to buy Russian oil, and then pretty quickly after that, this meeting was announced. It's a good time to remind our viewers that right now the U.S. doesn't do a lot of business with Russia, almost nothing at all, if you will. Those are sanctions that were enacted by President Biden when Russia invaded Ukraine. So with Vladimir Putin bringing all these sort of commerce leaders in Russia here, finance ministers, if you will, investment envoys, it's clear what his agenda is, and it might be clear what he's asking for in return to stop the fighting in Ukraine.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, you could argue cynically that the meeting, the summit today, could last a minute. The conversation going like this: President Trump to President Putin, are you prepared to agree to a ceasefire? President Putin, no. Conversation over. Of course, it's very unlikely to be like that. As I mentioned earlier, I'd be surprised if President Putin doesn't come with some kind of offer that tactically would be his style, if you like. I think it's notable too, because we always talk about the optics of these kinds of meetings, and they are important. As Peter was saying there, at this stage, President Putin isn't late. Will President Putin keep President Trump waiting is a great question, because it will tell you something about President Putin's approach to all of this, because he notoriously keeps people waiting. When I interviewed him, he kept us waiting for hours before the interview. I mean, clearly, I'm not the President of the United States, but he's famous for even keeping leaders waiting. So it is something that he does in order to try and get the upper hand. Will he try and do that here, or is he coming to try and flatter President Trump, and will he be coming with what he will see as gifts? That will be just the beginning of the performance, if you like, the theatrics that we're likely to see in the coming hours. And I will say something about that, Tom. Whatever we see at the end of all this, one thing we know about President Trump and President Putin that we've seen in the months past is that it doesn't end here. So just as an example of that, the Ukrainians, as Richard was saying, the Europeans have been negotiating themselves through the week, making their position clear, even while not having a seat at the table there in Alaska. And no matter what these two leaders walk out with at the end of all of this today, you can bet that members of the Trump administration who aren't at that meeting, and leaders in Europe, and President Zelensky will all have something to say about it. And what we know about President Trump, of course, is that he does shift. And again, just before I throw it back to you, Tom, we keep the messages from President Trump can be very, very difficult to read. So you mentioned those tariffs against India. I mean, that is a big deal. 50% tariffs against a partner of the United States, a crucial partner when it comes to China. That threat is a big deal, and it will have an impact in India, and it will have an impact on Russia, because India is buying cheap oil from Russia. On the other hand, on the way to this summit, President Trump posted on social media that he had a conversation with President Lukashenko of Belarus and described him as an internationally respected leader. Well, many in Europe would describe him as the last dictator in Europe. So you get different messages from President Trump, and that makes it, honestly, very challenging for us to know exactly where we're going to be in, according to the Kremlin, 6 or 7 hours' time.
Keir, we thank you for that. Stand by for us. You may see the camera movement a little bit on the left hand of the screen as Keir was talking. We are hearing sort of jet sounds overhead where we are in Anchorage, not too far from Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson. That camera may be trying to catch whatever jet that is landing near that base, if that indeed is Putin's plane. We are all waiting here. As Keir pointed out, Vladimir Putin, the Russian delegation, a little bit late right now. We're going to keep our eyes on the skies and seeing what happens to land. This might be, this looks like one of the Russian jets right now. This is not, I'm going to pause for a second, let that control room talk to me. Tell me one more time, guys. This is not Putin's plane, but one of the planes for the Russian delegation. They're arriving at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson. So things are happening slowly, not exactly on schedule. We didn't expect them to be. Things are very fluid, but the Russian delegation piecemealing their way over here to Alaska on U.S. soil. Again, the first time that Vladimir Putin will be here in about a decade. President Trump did take questions on Air Force One earlier today. We just have that video in now. Let's take a listen.
I can't tell you that. I don't know. It's there's nothing set in stone. I want certain things. I want to see a ceasefire. This is not to do with Europe. Europe's not telling me what to do. But they're going to be involved in the process, obviously, as will Zelensky. But I want to see a ceasefire rapidly. I don't know if it's going to be today, but I'm not going to be happy if it's not today. Everyone said it can't be today, but I'm just saying I want the killing to stop.
All right, President Trump pretty clear there. He says he wants the killing to stop. Garrett Hake here joining us as we're watching these planes. Again, a lot of things are fluid here. This may possibly be Vladimir Putin's plane. We're still waiting to see who gets off this plane as a few are coming in from Russia. Garrett, I do want to ask you, President Trump and sort of Trump speak, if you will, answering, dodging. He says he does ultimately want peace, but he doesn't want to raise the bar in this meeting. He doesn't want to be made a fool of, right?
That's right.
He has this meeting. He literally rolls out the red carpet for Vladimir Putin, invites him to America. America, and then Putin says nothing was accomplished.
Yeah, and he's also said he'd be willing to walk away completely from these negotiations if he doesn't think they're going well. That's something right out of the art of the deal, or out of the Trump playbook for decades, the idea that if you don't think you can get a deal, you don't want to be the sucker, if you will. So the president has been all over the map in terms of the expectations for this meeting. It's worth pointing out, as you did at the open, Tom, that we're 206 days behind schedule. I mean, the president ran on ending this war on day one, and so he's got to have some kind of result here. His base, his voters are tired of this war. They don't want to see any more American military support, any more money spent on it, and he's basically caught between his allies and his voter base. So he needs to come up with some kind of result. Whether that result can be a ceasefire, even a temporary one today, to let him walk out of here with some kind of victory, or whether that result ultimately ends up being him having to sort of play the high card and say, I'm walking out until you're willing to do more, and slap Putin with more sanctions, more tariffs. We're all just going to be waiting to find out.
Garrett Hake, we thank you for that. I'm being told now our Meet the Press moderator, Kristen Welker, is available right now as we're watching this plane come in, possibly Vladimir Putin's plane that has just landed from Russia. We're waiting on confirmation of that. We'll know as soon as we see some of the Russians starting to get off the plane. Kristen, you know, it's interesting. Earlier this week, President Trump announced how he was going to host the Kennedy Center Honors, that he was going to be the MC. He had to be talked into it because he had such high ratings on The Apprentice. And I'm wondering what he thought of this, because we know that he choreographs a lot of these events. And what we're seeing right now, right, these two world leaders meeting together, the red carpet has been rolled out. It is Alaska 2025, as this sign says there. Talk to us about sort of the optics of this moment.
Well, Tom, you highlight such an important aspect of how President Trump views his leadership, this deal maker in chief, and these big moments that he understands need to translate to a broad audience. As you say, he understands the significance of these optics. So this red carpet arrival that we're going to see, President Trump greeting President Putin, it will be very notable to see. Does President Trump walk up to the plane? Does he wait for President Putin to approach him? Those are the types of tea leaves we will start to read as this diplomatic historic summit gets underway, Tom. And I can tell you, in talking to Western officials, Ukrainian officials, they are watching all of this with a fair amount of trepidation, which I know you've been discussing with Keir and Richard, that promise that President Trump made to them that he would not negotiate territory in this initial summit, that those types of talks would have to be reserved for a follow-up meeting with President Zelensky. And of course, that would be the big optic, right, Tom, to have a trilateral meeting with President Zelensky and President Putin, but clearly not there yet. President Putin wouldn't agree to that, and that's part of why I think you are seeing President Trump really downplaying what can be accomplished in this initial meeting with President Putin.
Kristen, stand by for us. I want to bring in Keir Simmons again. Keir, the red carpet has been rolled out. We understand from the TikTok of events, the way we have been told, and again, these things could change, that President Trump himself will greet Vladimir Putin as he comes off the plane in a sign of respect. My question to you is, will these things work on someone like Vladimir Putin, a former KGB agent, a judo expert, somebody who has been a master in all types of warfare, if you will, including psychological warfare? Will this sort of butter him up, if you will, to get him to the place where Trump wants him to be?
No, is the honest answer. He's, never mind his Russian intelligence background, he's been at this for so long, 2 decades and more, as a leader in Russia, that nothing that President Trump does will appeal to kind of President Putin's emotions, if you like, but it will set the tone, and it can have an impact on the conversation. It can shift things in some ways, just as any negotiation can be impacted by those kinds of that kind of behavior. And I will tell you this, Tom, the Russian officials are not naive about President Trump. They are aware that, for example, he is unpredictable. And as we watch these pictures, I just want to invite viewers to remember President Trump standing side by side with Kim Jong-un of North Korea. And those were extraordinary pictures, which we still look back on. And yet, it's worth noting, President Trump ultimately walked away from those negotiations with North Korea. So it's because these are the optics now, may not necessarily tell us how President Trump will engage with President Putin in the hours ahead, and what he'll decide to do, what his team will decide to do. And the crucial part of all of this, the crucial aspect of all of this, and I've been told this by Russian officials, is they know this very well. They are very aware of, again, of President Trump's unpredictability, and that will be part of their calculations.
Again, as we watch some of the choreography here, we are expecting first President Trump to deplane, and at some point, Vladimir Putin will deplane as well. We understand the president will greet him. We don't know if that exactly will be on the tarmac by those steps or if it'll be on that stage that we've seen set out there, Alaska 2025. It stands to reason, President Trump, knowing the way he wants these things produced and choreographed, he'd want to walk side by side with Vladimir Putin up to that stage for a photo opportunity. But again, that stands to reason, and things could change. This plan could be fluid. You never really know what could happen. Garrett Hake is here by my side in Anchorage. And Garrett, we were just talking, someone who won't be here, at least we don't think, is the First Lady Melania Trump, someone who was born in that region, not far from Russia, who understands the region, and who President Trump himself said, whatever Putin is telling you, it's not the truth. He may be telling you this, but then he's bombing Ukraine right after.
Yeah, that's right. Melania Trump has been a much less visible presence during this administration than she was during the first, but her role is still notable, and her fingerprints are still on some Trump administration policies, including on this, when the president first really turned against Vladimir Putin publicly and started discussing his frustration with him. He twice invoked the First Lady during a single day, saying that he would get off the phone with President Putin and tell the First Lady about how nice the conversation had been, and then she would turn around and say, yes, but he just bombed a school or bombed a nursing home. The First Lady uses a very light touch behind the scenes, according to my reporting, with her husband on policy, but her influence here has been notable. Again, we talked earlier about the importance of who's in the president's ear as he's making these decisions. The First Lady, as a Putin critic to a certain degree, I don't think that can be understated, Tom.
Our Richard Engel is still live for us from Ukraine tonight. He has been speaking to soldiers. He's been speaking to regular Ukrainians over the last week. Richard, what are you hearing on the streets of Ukraine in the various cities? Because you've been all over since you've gotten there. What are you hearing? Is there any optimism that maybe this could be the first step in the path to peace?
I think there's hope, but I wouldn't say there's optimism. There is hope because people here want a ceasefire. For the last 3.5 years, this country has been under siege. There are currently no flights in Ukraine. There haven't been for 3.5 years. Every night there are attacks on Ukrainian cities, increasingly by drone, but also by missiles. There's a draft here. Military-age men can walk down the street and suddenly find themselves surrounded by police and soldiers, given a draft card and sent to the front lines. We were just at a funeral for a soldier who was drafted, sent to the front lines, and lost his life, and he leaves behind 2 children. So Ukrainians want this to be over. They would like to see a ceasefire potentially tonight. Every Ukrainian will tell you that. Every Ukrainian that I've spoken to certainly told me that. But they don't believe that giving Vladimir Putin land is going to do that, that he will suddenly be satisfied, that he's taken enough of Ukraine, and that he will walk away. Another thing that Ukrainians say is that we consistently overestimate Vladimir Putin's strength. We talk about today how President Trump is going to greet him, rolled out the red carpet, might be greeting him as soon as that somebody comes down the stairs of that aircraft, and that he is won. But Russia has also lost a great deal. You mentioned earlier, 1 million Russian casualties since the start of the war. Russia has also had to draft its own citizens. It had to rely on a mercenary group called the Wagner Group, which ultimately then turned against Vladimir Putin and tried to take over the government, marching toward the Kremlin. Vladimir Putin has had to lean on North Korea and take North Korean troops to help out his ranks, ask North Korea for ammunition and artillery rounds, Ask Iran for missiles and drones. Russia's become increasingly dependent on China to keep its economy going. So both Ukraine and Russia do have an incentive right now to reach a ceasefire, but it all, at the end of the day, comes down to territory, because you can stop the fighting. The Russians can say that they will stop the drone attacks, that they will stop the artillery attacks, stop the missile attacks, but will they give Ukraine back the land that they took, this 20% of Ukrainian territory, or will this peace agreement give that land to Russia forever? And that is the main question that people here in Ukraine are wondering, and they're feeling quite powerless as they're watching these images and not in Alaska, not in the room, just given this promise that maybe down the road, if this all goes well, they'll be folded into the process when their country's future is on the line.
Richard, I do want to ask you, after President Trump was on that call with Zelensky and European allies this week, it was reported from the UK Prime Minister and Zelensky that President Trump said there'd be very severe consequences if Putin didn't start to agree to some type of peace deal. What do you think President Trump meant by that? Do you think it was more than just more economic sanctions? Do you think it is arming Ukraine even more than we are right now?
It would probably be some combination of those two, targeting the Russian energy sector. There are already many sanctions against Russia. It is hard to sanction them even more, and China has consistently been offering Russia a lifeline. But he certainly could provide Ukraine with more weapons, could certainly provide Ukraine with more intelligence, allow the Ukrainians to use American weapon systems and fire them more deeply into Russia, can put a lot more pressure.
Richard, we thank you. Stand by for us. We're seeing our first images right now of President Trump on the left hand of your screen. You see him there deplaning Air Force One after having touched down in Elmendorf, Richardson, our joint base here in Anchorage, just outside of Anchorage. The honor guard waiting for him there. We know he had some key meetings on the plane as he waited for Vladimir Putin's plane to land, including meeting with the governor of Alaska and the 2 Republican senators. The president walking towards that red carpet. And now we see Vladimir Putin on the right hand of your screen coming down, shuffling down at somewhat of a brisk pace there. There is a stage that has been set with the title Alaska 2025 at the end of the red carpet. We'll see if both leaders sort of make their way towards that stage for a photo. A reminder, this is Vladimir Putin's first time in the United States on U.S. soil in about a decade. We understand the two leaders have not met in quite some time face-to-face. They have had several conversations. They have met in passing. This face-to-face, though, will be the longest they've met since that Helsinki summit we saw in that news conference that made so many headlines. We are expecting a news conference later tonight after this summit. It's unclear exactly at what time that's going to happen. We will bring it to you live. The other big unknown is, will both of these world leaders take questions? They did last time. And there's a good case to be made that they likely will this time as well. President Trump making that long walk from Air Force One to this stage now. I don't know if we have a wider shot of this to see kind of what both men are looking at right now and where they're headed. It looks like President Trump is waiting for Vladimir Putin here to greet him. The leader of the United States, the leader of Russia, exchanging hands in hopes of finding peace in Ukraine. Big smiles from both men. They will have interpreters at these meetings, but clearly sharing some English back and forth there. right now. We can see it in the air. Looks like a few, from our perspective here, a few bombers in the air and some fighter jets right behind them. And here's the moment.
President Putin, will you agree to a ceasefire? Mr. President, what's your message to Vladimir Putin? Mr. Putin, did you underestimate Ukraine?
Posing for photos, and you can hear those American reporters already peppering Vladimir Putin with questions, asking if there will be a ceasefire. Putin signaling he can't hear them. Unclear if he can or not.
Thank you, press. Thank you, press. Thank you, press. Thank you, press. Let's go.
Okay. President Trump entering his vehicle there, the Beast, of course. And it looks like Vladimir Putin, I'm being told, got in with him as well, so they will share this ride together.
The driver's here.
Obviously, the Secret Service inside the vehicle, guarding that vehicle as well. But it looks like the two men, Garrett Hake, will have a moment to themselves.
Yeah,
without anyone else in there. I mean, from what we can see.
That's right, and this might end up being the only moment the two have to themselves.
This might be the bilateral meeting inside
right.
the Beast.
Yeah, just a few hundred yards of a drive, perhaps just across the tarmac after what we were told would be a lengthy bilateral meeting, the two men meeting one-on-one. They'll now have other advisors in the room with them. But as the car sits on the tarmac here, a chance to talk privately. Putin obviously does speak some English, uses a translator in most of these diplomatic situations. Boy, this will be the conversation that people will be wondering about at the end of the day.
And it's even more important now, this moment that we're looking at, both President Trump and Vladimir Putin inside the Beast, which is the presidential Cadillac that has been retrofitted to carry the President of the United States. You can see, it looks like President Trump is actively speaking there, animated. And this is important because you said the bilateral, the way it was supposed to be set, has now expanded. And there's going to be other leaders inside the room, not just President Trump and Vladimir Putin.
That's right. Putin will have two of his closest advisors with him as well. President Trump will have Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, and Steve Witkoff, who's been his special envoy and one of his best friends going back decades. Witkoff's relationship with the president is extremely important. He's one of the few people in the president's life that he trusts implicitly. He's been the go-between between the Russians and President Trump up until this point.
He's someone who credit should be given, right? Because Witkoff, it was said that Witkoff, after that meeting with Putin, it led to this in some ways.
That's right. Witkoff came into this openly saying he's a diplomatic amateur. He's a real estate developer. He's a friend of the president.
The leader of Russia. You could think Ukrainians are not going to like this image right here, Garrett. You have a laughing Vladimir Putin inside the vehicle of the President of the United States after 60 to 100,000 Ukrainians have been slaughtered in their country, have been killed in war, and their country was invaded for no reason. No reason. Putin has given reasons, but no reason that any other country that is an ally of the United States or Ukraine has accepted.
Yeah, and certainly a striking contrast to the President Zelensky's visit to the White House when he was asked to leave after that Oval Office blow-up. Obviously, that relationship has improved significantly since then, but it couldn't be more different than what you're seeing with President Putin here.
But this is the first step in what the Russians have said could be 6 to 7 hours. It is unclear. That would have sort of changed the schedule we've seen. From what we understand, Garrett, they're going to meet with their delegations, which could take hours, but President Trump has said he'll know after 2 minutes if they're going to have a deal or not. And then after, there'll be a lunch with those delegations. And then after that, at some point, will be that news conference.
That's right. And we'll know something about this meeting in that news conference before a single word is spoken. I mean, the president has made it pretty clear. If things go well, he wants Vladimir Putin to be with him. If they don't, he may come out on his own and describe what had gone on during that meeting. I think but this first bilateral meeting is going to be the whole key here, right? I mean, how things go in the first 15 to 20 minutes, I think, will determine everything else we see thereafter. The president and the Russian delegation are clearly prepared for the possibility this goes well, where you've got business officials, Commerce Secretary, the Treasury Secretary. Their input only matters if you're starting to have a broader conversation about peace and what the relationship looks like afterwards.
And there might be some awkward moments in this meeting. I mean, you have someone like Secretary of State Marco Rubio, along with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who are not friends to Russia, who have been very clear, who have called Vladimir Putin a butcher, who consider him, much like China, enemies of the the United States.
That's right. I mean, Rubio's career, going back to his time in the Senate, he was very hawkish about Russia, very skeptical of Russia. He's the lead Republican author of the Senate Intelligence Committee report that said Russia was meddling in the 2016 election, something that this president has long disputed. But he has, very much come around to the president's view on this conflict and on the necessity of working with Russia to achieve peace, that you're not going to get there without negotiations. You're not going to get there by Ukraine winning the war. He doesn't think it's possible for Ukraine to militarily win the war. And so they are in alignment on policy, if not on their general viewpoint towards Russia.
I want to get back to Keir Simmons now. Keir, who has spoken with Vladimir Putin, was just sending me a WhatsApp text telling me that when he spoke and interviewed Vladimir Putin, you were telling me, Keir, that he does speak a little bit of English. Obviously not fluent, but he speaks a little bit of English. You were observing all these scenes as we were watching them in real time, live here in our continuous coverage. Talk to me about some of the moments that stood out for you as both leaders came together, shook hands, and then walked that red carpet.
Yeah, it's stunning. It's already absolutely stunning to see that image of President Putin. And you put it so well, after so many people have died in Ukraine, smiling and laughing, sitting in that vehicle with President Trump. That will be an image that will be replayed and will be rewatched for years to come. That is a history-making image that we just saw live, Tom. And what I can tell you, because I have spoken with President Putin in English in the past, is that it is a very stilted conversation. He does have some English. He's able to say, in my experience, he's able to say, how are you, things like that. And there is video, there is tape of President Putin speaking in English a long time ago, a lifetime ago it feels like now, for example, at Buckingham Palace, giving a speech in English in front of the late Queen. So we do know that he can speak English, but he isn't fluent in English the way he is, for example, in German. So what were those two men talking about? I'll add something else into all of this, Tom, too, is that the last time that President Putin and President Trump met during the President Trump's first term, there was real controversy over the moments when President Trump and President Putin were alone together and talking without anyone taking notes, without an interpreter. And we've seen already the controversy that has surrounded President Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, going to Russia and meeting with President Putin without a US translator, without, it appears, a note taker. There's been reports even in these past few days about the potential that there may have been some confusion in the last meeting because it wasn't clear exactly that there wasn't a note taker, it appears. It wasn't clear exactly what the Russians were proposing. So that moment that you just watched in the car with the two men smiling, you could certainly see President Putin smiling and laughing. It does suggest a kind of a bon ami at the beginning. You wonder what on earth they were saying to each other. Maybe just niceties. But another thing too, before I throw back Tom there, is that, of course, as we mentioned, President Putin is very, very good at this. He has long experience at this, and he will know he's being photographed. He will know how he wants it to appear. That is a deliberate act by President Putin to be in that kind of visible mood in the opening minutes.
It's one of these moments sort of in history that it's a stunning image right now, right? But it could tell a larger story. If there is no peace, if President Trump is not successful, people will remember this moment. But if there is peace, if this leads to bigger things, to a ceasefire and eventually peace, this could be the moment where people say, President Trump, look what he did, look how he handled Vladimir Putin, and he was able to get to that point. But for right now, we won't know, and we have this image right now. I do want to go to Richard Engel. Richard, I know it's late in Ukraine. It's after 10 o'clock where you are right now. I know you're watching our coverage and hearing our coverage. I'm not sure if you saw that moment of Vladimir Putin smiling inside that vehicle next to President Trump, but that's going to hurt, I know, inside of Ukraine.
100% is going to hurt, and you had it right. It's after 10 o'clock. If these meetings go on for many hours, most Ukrainians are not going to see them in real time. They'll be learning about them tomorrow. The government is clearly watching this very closely, but generally, Ukrainians are nervous. They are looking at these two men, Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump, and they know their country's future is in their hands, and that makes them concerned because Vladimir Putin is their enemy, and President Trump has not always been their friend. You were talking earlier about the striking difference between this red carpet greeting and when President Zelensky was browbeaten and then kicked out of the United States in the White House, or kicked out of the White House meeting. So there are the Ukrainians here are worried, but as we were saying earlier, they can't keep this war going forever. They do need a ceasefire. They have not been able to push out all of the Russian forces from all of their territory, despite 3.5 years of fighting. So they will take a ceasefire. They'll take a ceasefire today. President Zelensky has said that. President Zelensky has also implied that he's willing to negotiate on territory as well, but they want security guarantees primarily from the United States and Europe that will prevent Vladimir Putin from invading later and taking another piece of territory. But yes, Ukrainians are watching this, or will be watching this in the morning, and making that contrast to how their president was treated in the Oval Office and the reception that Vladimir Putin is being given right now.
All right, Richard Engel, stand by for us as well. I want to get back to our chief White House correspondent, Peter Alexander, who is on Joint Base Elmendorf, Richardson, right now. Peter, walk our viewers through what exactly is happening at the moment. We know there was about a 5-minute drive when President Trump and Putin took off from the tarmac to that meeting. It was once bilateral, but it has since expanded. Where does it go from here?
Yeah, well, to be very clear, I think what we're watching, Tom, is not only historic and unprecedented, but really quite striking, startling, certainly in the eyes of the president's and Vladimir Putin's critics right now, who are looking at this and have criticized the very meeting itself as a reward for Vladimir Putin. I'm just struck by that shot of Vladimir Putin in the backseat of the vehicle of the Beast alongside Donald Trump, smiling and laughing, the former ambassador to Russia, Mike McFaul, telling us a short time ago that Putin's English is enough basically for a short car ride, maybe 10 to 15 minutes worth, but clearly there were no interpreters in that vehicle right there. So while we had been told that one-on-one meeting had gone away and would only be a 3-on-3 today, clearly Vladimir Putin had 10 to 15 minutes at least privately with Donald Trump to share whatever private thoughts he wanted to with him in English before it began. So of course, then next up on the docket for each of them is this meeting behind closed doors, where Russian media is reporting that the foreign minister Sergei Lavrov will be among those joining Vladimir Putin in the room. Secretary of State Marco Rubio will be there for the United States alongside the special envoy Steve Witkoff. Notably, Rubio in the past, as it related to Russia's involvement in the war taking place in Syria, in Aleppo, accused Vladimir Putin of war crimes. So you can only imagine what Marco Rubio's thoughts are as he witnesses the president of the United States with this sort of close, cozy, comfortable relationship with Donald Trump privately before that broader meeting takes place. And as it relates to Lavrov specifically, as we read some of the tea leaves today, I was struck, as you may have seen earlier, that he had in Russian the abbreviation for the Soviet Union on his chest, on his sweatshirt when he arrived late yesterday. If there are any signals to be taken in terms of the diplomacy, that clearly was an example by one of Vladimir Putin's closest advisors and allies to demonstrate Putin's commitment remains to returning the Soviet Union, Russia, to its sort of Soviet glory as the Russians see it right now. So again, as the two of them go behind closed doors, and you see that photo from a short time ago, we expect that the cameras will be invited in briefly, another opportunity perhaps to shout some questions at the two. Donald Trump saying that if things went well, he would not answer questions alongside Vladimir Putin, would answer those independently by himself when he arrived here for the joint news conference at the end of the day, that he would skip out, just do it and take off. But from everything that we're seeing right now, this appears to be exactly as Donald Trump had choreographed it. Recognize this is not just a deal maker in chief, as he proclaims himself, but also sort of a reality TV star in chief, a producer in chief. And every moment from the red carpet where he greeted Vladimir Putin to the stagecraft of them standing framed by fighter jets, a B-2 similar similar to those B-2s that were used in the U.S. strike most recently in Iran, alongside fighter jets flying overhead, then the two of them entering the vehicle together. This has all the stagecraft that Donald Trump has made a career on in the past, and certainly it's stagecraft and sort of pageantry that he wanted to shower on Vladimir Putin, his guest today. Tom.
Peter Alexander first. Peter, we thank you. We're going to be waiting because at any moment we expect to get our first view inside of that bilateral meeting. It has grown, not exactly a bilateral meeting, it's something bigger now, but we should get our first images, we think, somewhere within the next 10 minutes, maybe less than that. Again, the schedule is kind of fluid. They've stuck somewhat to it. It's never going to be exact from what we get in the planning phase of these big events, but they are very close to following that schedule. The big question right now is how long will that meeting go? Again, President Trump has said he'll know within the first 2 minutes if he can strike a deal or not. But we'll have to wait and see. The Russians have already said they want this meeting to be possibly 5, 6, 7 hours. Again, we don't know if that's going to be the case, if they're just saying that, or again, maybe they're setting expectations as well. Kristen Welker has been watching all of this for us. And Kristen, we sort of know some of the images already that are going to be highlighted from this event so far. We don't know everything that was discussed, but we know everything we've seen. And as we were just talking, here's our first images from inside that meeting here. We see President Trump and Vladimir Putin right there, along with both delegations, Sergei Lavrov by his side. The pictures are a little pixelated right now. Looks like Steve Witkoff, Witkoff, and Senator Rubio, Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Let's pause and listen in. So we'll peel back the curtain here just a little bit. We're going to peel back the curtain here a little bit. This is what is called a pool spray. The pool is invited in. They're a pool of journalists. Not a lot of them, but there's obviously a photographer and some reporters. Garrett Hake is by my side. He can join in here and give us the play-by-play as well. They're allowed to go and take the shot, and then, of course, reporters, being the reporters they are going to ask questions. That's what they were doing here. So we see Witkoff here. We see Rubio. I think it's the interpreter.
That's right.
Who's next to President Trump. And then on the other side, we have Vladimir Putin and Sergei Lavrov, the English interpreter. I can't see who else is there. The reporters asking questions, and then we understand probably White House aides getting in the way saying, thank you, press,
That's
so
right.
They can't hear the questions anymore.
Typically, these sprays are called sprays, but you are in and out very quickly. And during the Trump era, these have often morphed into mini press conferences, as the president likes to take questions on the front end of the meeting, sometimes because he wants to talk, sometimes because he wants his guests to be, put in a position of having to answer questions. Here, quite the opposite. Very quickly moved out of the room, perhaps in deference to the Russian president.
But it was somewhat telling. Do we think, Aaron, I know a lot of these things we don't know, do we think that is going to be the established meeting? Because it looked like that was the team that President Trump was bringing initially before it expanded. So maybe there'll be more than one meetings. Maybe they'll bring in other people as the meeting expands. It looks like these might be the main players for now.
Yeah, that's right. I think this is what was the bilateral meeting, the expanded meeting. This will be the core conversation here today. The lunch typically is a little bit more of a formality during the way the president likes to host these meetings. That's the key meeting that I think we're looking at.
If we can pause this is something interesting that I'm just noticing right now. I'm going to ask our director, Anna Mancini, to go back to this video, re-rack it, and because there's something on the background. It says Alaska 2025, but I want to say I made out the word peace on there as well. I don't know if we can go back to that video, but in the background here, it looks like. And if
Pursuing
you guys can see
peace,
it does it say pursuing peace?
Yeah, it's the same branding you see on the stage that's set for the joint news conference here. I mean, this is very much, again, for a conference that's come together in a week, they're clearly trying to set the branding. I mean, Peter touched on this. I mean, this is a reality television president, but it's also someone who made his career in business and in branding, trying to set the stakes here.
Yeah, I want to bring in Kristen Welker here, our Meet the Press moderator, of course. Kristen, you've seen some of the images that have come out so far. That was our first look at the bilateral meeting. Give us some of your thoughts so far.
Well, Tom, I'm hearing from a former U.S. official who says this looks good for Putin in the first inning, really referencing what you were talking about earlier with Garrett, with Keir, with Richard as well, the fact that you saw that smiling Vladimir Putin in the Beast driving to this site of the first location. But this official also stressing this is very early on. We have to see what happens. This is going to be a very long stretch. And I think one of the big questions looming large over this time Tom, is what exactly is the mindset of these two leaders? I spoke with a senior administration official earlier today who talked about President Trump's mindset and said, quote, the president is realistic that this is likely a multi-step process, and he's ready and positive about this step forward. I thought that word realistic was so significant and raised the question, is he approaching this differently than, for example, he did his summit with President Putin back in 2018? You'll recall that during that summit, that's when President Putin told him that Russia didn't meddle in the U.S. election. President Trump at the time said he believed him. He had to walk back those comments in the days after that because there was so much backlash. Is President Trump, in fact, approaching this from a more realistic standpoint? I think that's going to be one of the critical questions that determines whether the president can get an unconditional ceasefire coming out of this summit today, Tom.
All right, Kristen Welker, stand by for us. We now have a clearer feed of that first shot from the bilateral meeting. Let's roll that now.
Audio?
Looks like there's no audio on this feed, but you can see all the players that are involved, at least in this first phase of the bilateral meeting. Questions were asked to both leaders. They didn't take the questions, and then quickly the White House press pool, if you will, the aides, I should say, wrapped them pretty fast as the questions continued, and they somewhat blocked the cameras, and well, is what it looked like, and said thank you, press, to make sure no other questions can get in. Both leaders waiting to, I would say, holding their fire right now, right? Keeping their ammo dry at this point. There's a lot to talk about. There's a lot to discuss. President Trump has said he wants peace, but he is just setting the table for another meeting. Putin, for his part, has said that he likes the president's energy. Putin maybe hearing a question he doesn't like. Oh, okay. Looks like Putin responded to some question. Unclear what he said or what was asked. We're going to get more audio as this feed kind of comes through, and they put it through our system. Again, Putin has said that he has called for this meeting. This happened after Witkoff went to Moscow, met with Vladimir Putin, and now we have both leaders here in Alaska on U.S. soil in hopes of taking those first steps to the journey of peace for all the people of Ukraine who have had to live with that Russian invasion for nearly 3.5 years, that have lost 60 to 100,000 of their brave men and women. So many young men, even elderly men now fighting in Ukraine. People that were not even of fighting age anymore have come back to fight. And we've seen firsthand sort of the changing battlefield. This war has gone from trench warfare to now more foxholes and drone warfare. And Ukraine surprising the world with some of these sneak attacks with drones inside of Russia. And we should point out Ukraine, the much smaller of the two countries in every which way, landmass, population, wealth, military strength, and they have held off this Russian superpower for 3.5 years and have fought so violently. As Russia continues their aggression, a lot of people have said that this summer has been a turning point, that Vladimir Putin wanted to push more into Ukraine. He has been unable to do so. And as we have pointed out throughout our coverage, they have called in North Koreans. They have called in prisoners. They've let people get out of prison to go fight the war in Ukraine. They've asked North Korea for armaments as well. The war has changed a lot, not as easy as maybe Vladimir Putin had initially thought. Garrett Hake is here by my side, joining our coverage as well, been here from the get-go, to be a fly on the wall in that bilateral meeting right now to see what the first question asked is and what Vladimir Putin really wants. Does he want a business deal here? Is he interested in peace, or is he interested in staying in power and strengthening his military through selling foreign oil?
Yeah, I mean, it's worth noting that this meeting only came about on the day that secondary tariffs were supposed to go into effect on Russia. Steve Witkoff was there on last Friday, which was the deadline that the president had set. President Putin then asking for this meeting. It's possible that all of this is a stalling tactic by the Russian president just to keep the conversation going, keep his opportunity to pursue that war going, as you were just outlining, Tom, a war in which he has all the traditional military advantages over a smaller neighbor. But as Keir and some of our other analysts have talked about, Russia wants back on the world stage. They want back into an opportunity to be seen as a player on par with the United States. And the president is giving it to them, at least in some extent, with these extraordinary images we've already seen, the greeting on the tarmac here, the B-2 flyover, and that drive, perhaps as long as 15 minutes. We're trying to figure out exactly where the B East went from the moment that picked up the two presidents and took them to that bilateral summit. But that opportunity, that image alone of the two presidents sitting side by side and smiling as they have a truly private conversation, Tom, something that's incredibly rare between world leaders who are close, not world leaders who are, at least on paper, adversaries.
Yeah, the president granted one-on-one interview while he was on Air Force One on the way to Russia. We have a clip from that interview. Let's roll that now.
So what are your expectations? I mean, is the goal of this meeting in Alaska to walk away with a ceasefire?
So when you talk about deals, it's all I do. My whole life I do deals. You never know. You don't like to have too many expectations. You want it because you have to weave and bob, and you don't know what's going to happen. But we're going to go and find out. I'd like to see a ceasefire. I wouldn't be thrilled if I didn't get it, but everyone says you're not going to get the ceasefire. It'll take place on the second meeting. The second meeting is going to be but I'm not going to be happy with that. So we'll see what happens. I'm going to be, I won't be happy if I walk away without some form of a ceasefire. Now, I say this, and I've said it from the beginning, this is really setting the table today. We're going to have another meeting if things work out, which will be very soon. Or we're not going to have any more meetings at all, maybe ever.
All right, the president's saying a lot of things there, but something very interesting happened in that interview. It sounded like he was setting a goalpost. Kristen Welker is still with us, joining our coverage from Washington. Kristen, it sounded like he wants a ceasefire out of this meeting. He kind of went back later and said, well, actually, I'm just setting the table for the next meeting, which had been the standard line all week. But he said there a few times he wants a ceasefire, and he won't be happy if he doesn't get it coming out of this meeting.
There's no doubt, Tom, that Western officials are putting that pressure on him, that is going to be the measure in their eyes of whether this is a successful meeting. They want an unconditional ceasefire immediately. That word unconditional is so significant. If there are strings attached, if there are no ceasefire at all, this will not be viewed as a success. He also said he wants that follow-up meeting, which would have to include President Zelensky, who of course has not been invited to this meeting at the request of President Putin. I had an opportunity to interview President Zelensky 3 different times, Tom. I can tell you he's adamant. He is not going to cede this territory. He points to the fact this is not just a conversation about territory. It's a conversation about Ukrainian lives, the people who live in that territory. Zelensky referring to President Putin, Tom, as a terrorist in my first interview with him, and more recently, this past February, saying that he believes Putin is poised to move into other neighboring countries. And that's why the stakes here are so high, Tom. That's why you have European officials who are watching this with some consternation, with concern, because they believe this is, yes, about Ukraine. This is about Western democracies, but this is about the security, really, of all of Europe in their eyes, Tom, and that is why, from their perspective, the stakes here are so high. So again, you heard the urgency there in President Trump's voice that this is not just about this initial meeting, but trying to have a follow-on meeting as quickly as possible with President Zelensky. You talk about the optics, you talk about the reality TV commander-in-chief. For him, the gold standard, the big optic that he wants is not just standing next to President Putin, but standing next to President Putin and Zelensky. Tom.
Garrett, that was sort of a master class in studying a Trump answer. Yeah. He said he wants a ceasefire. He said he'll be upset if he doesn't get it after this first meeting. Then he kind of went back and said, we're just setting the table for the next meeting. Kind of hard to understand, but it feels like, again, and we're sort of interpreting here, it feels like the standard line from the White House was, we're setting the table, we're going to keep the bar low, and then Trump showing a little bit of his cards.
That's right. I mean, earlier this week, the press secretary called this entire meeting a listening exercise. Yeah. This was certainly more advanced than that from President Trump, suggesting that he does want to see a ceasefire, and if he doesn't get it, he would be unhappy. But what that unhappiness means, I think, is very much an interesting question, because the president has expressed this unhappiness before. He's talked about this repeatedly, that Putin keeps bombing cities and that's not good for him. His options to inflict more economic pain on Putin are extremely limited, and they would potentially inflict economic pain on Americans, too. What do I mean by that? We saw him say he's going to put these extra tariffs on India to try to, punish them for buying Russian oil. Well, the only country that buys more Russian oil than India is China. Is the president willing to increase economic pressure on China at the expense of getting a deal with the Chinese on trade, on TikTok? That would be an escalation on a whole other front that I think he's been very trepidatious about going down that road.
I understand we have a little bit more from that interview. Let's play that now.
So if you were to paint a picture of what perfect looks like coming out of Alaska today, what does that look like in your mind?
Look, it's not for me to negotiate a deal for Ukraine, but I can certainly set the table to negotiate the deal. And our next meeting will have President Zelensky and President Putin and probably me. I'd like to focus on doing our country, but you know, I get these interruptions. I've solved 6 wars in 6 months when you think about it, and that's from Pakistan to India. That was going to be a terrible one. Planes being shot down. That was getting ready to flare, and then nuclear powers, and so many others. And you know,
well, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Congo, Rwanda. In fact, did you see that Hillary Clinton yesterday said that if you got this deal done and not capitulate to Putin, that she would nominate you for the Nobel Peace Prize?
If President Trump were the architect of that, I'd nominate him for a Nobel Peace Prize.
Well, that was very nice. I may have to start liking her again.
President Trump there. To give you guys some context here, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton had put out a post on social media saying that if Ukraine did not give back any land and there was peace, she would nominate President Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize. Garrett, of course, the former secretary, setting the bar quite high. No one thinks that Russia is going to cede all the land that they have conquered in this unjust war without getting to a peace agreement in that regard.
No, and Russia said some of it, like the Crimean Peninsula, which they took in 2014, is never going back to Ukraine. They very much see that as part of Russia. Kudos to Brett Baer, our Fox News colleague, for trying very hard to find some bar that the president will set and stick to determine whether this summit is a success or failure. The president's been very reticent to get pinned down on that. I think having learned his lesson with Putin in particular, as kind of a wily character who's probably not going to agree to anything.
Can we put the context of the 6 wars, the peacemaker in 6 wars, just to walk our viewers through that? Because we heard the president say that.
That's right. So the president has involved himself in some of these other conflicts. Remember, there was a brief, I won't call it a war, a shooting conflict between India and Pakistan over Kashmir, which pops off every now and again. The president used some threats of actions on trade to try to stop that. He recently held the leaders of Armenia and Azerbaijan at the White House to work out an agreement, and he had the leaders of Congo and Rwanda in as well. He's missing the big 2, though, and I think this is the challenge for him in terms of accountability to his voters, talking about ending Israel's war in Gaza quickly and talking about ending this war between Russia and Ukraine quickly. Those are the ones he ran on, and I think those are still the big missing pieces. But this idea of the Nobel Peace Prize, you can kind of laugh it off, but this is something that the president has talked about going back to his first term, the fact that President Obama won one and that he hasn't.
And there's something reporting that he has asked leaders for it to, hey, nominate me kind of thing.
Which is, by the way, also a great way for these leaders to flatter the president as they come in and set their meetings to say, I've done this on your behalf. It is something that he cares personally about, and something that, I think is a good way to kind of get in his head about, striking these kind of deals if you're a foreign leader and wants to do so. And look,
if there is peace in Ukraine and he is the architect and he gets that deal done, I mean, there's going to be a major argument for him to win that award. Kristen, I want to bring you back in here. It sounds like in this interview, the president has sort of laid out exactly what he wants, all of his goals. A ceasefire out of this meeting. After that, a second meeting, possibly in the United States. He did say that involving Zelensky and Vladimir Putin, he has now raised the bar pretty high, because that is going to be a tall order. I'm not saying he can't have it, he can't get it done. He might get it done, but that is going to be very difficult.
It's going to be very difficult, Tom, and that's why this is, quite frankly, the biggest test of his foreign policy yet. Remember, he campaigned on a promise to end this war within 24 hours, and now, talk about moving the goalposts, he's acknowledged that that goal has proven far more difficult than he initially thought, and it fits into this broader pattern of promises made about deals that he wants to make, and these deals proving elusive. This is one that has really divided really lawmakers here in Washington, Republicans, many who say they don't want to continue to fund this war. They don't want to continue to send U.S. military equipment to Ukraine. So there's so much riding on this deal Tom, this real test of whether he can, in fact, fulfill that promise of being deal maker in chief. And you're absolutely right. He set the bar quite high in that latest interview that he conducted.
Kristen, thank you. I want to get right over to Keir Simmons. He has a bit of new reporting that is incredibly interesting. Keir, tell our viewers what you've just learned about sort of what happened on the tarmac and right after President Putin, I should say President Trump and Vladimir Putin shook hands. What happened after that when they moved towards the vehicles?
Right, Tom, while you guys have been having that great conversation about what's being talked about now between President Trump and President Putin, we've been reporting out back, just looking at exactly what did happen when they first met on the tarmac there, and that moment when President Putin gets in the beast with President Trump and they drive off, and then you see President Putin looking out of the window, smiling and laughing. Now, Russian media has been reporting since then that there was a car for President Putin. It's called an Aurus. It was there on the tarmac, according to Russian media, waiting for him. Now, one of our great producers, Russia expert, was looking at the video herself and saw that vehicle on the tarmac, saw that Aurus. So she able to confirm simply from the video that there was a car there that should have been carrying President Putin. So two pieces of this, Tom. One, that the Russian journalists are reporting that the plan was that President Putin would take his own vehicle, and that one of our own great colleagues has seen that vehicle there. All of that will raise the question, why did President Putin get in the beast with President Trump? Was he invited by President Trump? Did he just choose to do it? Was it his plan? How did he manage to get himself in that vehicle, as you guys have been talking about, for an immediate bilateral with President Trump, with, we have to assume, potentially no interpreter, no note taker, and again, meeting when President Trump and President Putin met during the first term, and there were no note takers there, and perhaps even not a US interpreter, that caused controversy. We will be talking about what happened in that car for weeks, months, maybe longer.
Keir Simmons, first, I want to get back to Richard Engel, who's live for us tonight in Ukraine, where it is getting late over there. Richard, you know, as we have mentioned, Ukraine is on the outside looking in, even though it was their country that was invaded, even though it is their country that is trying to fend off Russia. My question to you is, if President Trump is successful, if he gets that second meeting with Putin and Trump, will Zelensky attend that as well?
100%. President Zelensky has been pushing for a summit with Vladimir Putin, a summit that could be organized by the United States. Just a short while ago, President Zelensky said that he would attend another summit if it were held. So this is something that Ukraine absolutely wants. They would rather be there right now, and they're worried about the table being set before they can arrive and deals being made before they are in the room. But yes, they would certainly go.
Okay, Richard Engel for us. I want to get right back over to Peter Alexander, who's inside where that news conference is going to take place later tonight. Peter, walk our viewers through what's going to happen over the next hour or 2 hours or so.
Yeah, Tom, so as we expect, there's going to be more of this bilateral meeting, a 3-on-3 between the leaders on both sides, Trump, Putin, and some of their top deputies, the Secretary of State Marco Rubio for the U.S., Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister on the Russian side, before they have an expanded bilateral meeting. A wider group of individuals will be there. And Donald Trump had said that he'll know within the first couple of minutes if Vladimir Putin was open to doing a deal here, a deal toward peace. It appears clear that Vladimir Putin is open to dealing, whether it's on the topic of peace is unclear, as evidenced by those he's bringing into the room with him for that expanded bilateral. One of those who won't be there is the negotiator on the Russian side as it relates to the war in Ukraine. Tom, certainly some others will be there on the topic of the economy.
Peter,
here we are.
Let's listen to the gaggle now that was on Air Force One.
Ceasefire rapidly. I don't know if it's going to be today, but I'm not going to be happy if it's not today. Everyone said it can't be today, but I'm just saying I want the killing to stop. I'm in this to stop the killing. You know, we're not putting up any money. We're making money. They're buying our weapons, and we're sending them to NATO, and NATO's sending us big, beautiful checks. But I don't care about that. I care about, it was a big factor when Biden spent $350 billion about that. What I do care about is last week, 7,011 people were lost, almost all soldiers. 36 people in a town which got hit by a missile. But 7,000 set a new stock market record again. We have hundreds of billions of dollars flowing in from tariffs. We're the hottest country. We were a dead country, like doornails, a dead country. 1 year ago, we were dead as a doornail. And now we have the hottest country. And he wants a piece of that because his country is not hot economically. In fact, it's the opposite. And China's not doing well economically. But look, I want everybody to do well. The war's got to stop and the killing's got to stop.
Mr. President, what do you mean by severe consequences? To take questions. We saw that Russia continued its violence into Ukraine last night, launching even more drones. What did you make of that?
Well, I think they're trying to negotiate. He's trying to set a stage. I mean, in his mind, that helps him make a better deal. It actually hurts him. But in his mind, that helps him make a better deal if they can continue the killing. Maybe it's a part of the world. Maybe it's just his fabric, his genes, his genetics. But he thinks that makes him, gives him strength in negotiating. I think it hurts him, but I'll be talking to him about it.
And on the table for discussions today, Mr. President, are the territorial swaps on the table? Will you be discussing that?
They'll be discussed, but I've got to let Ukraine make that decision. And I think they'll make a proper decision. But I'm not here to negotiate for Ukraine. I'm here to get them at a table. And I think you have two sides. Look, Vladimir Putin wanted to take all of Ukraine. If I wasn't president, he would right now be taking all of Ukraine. But he's not going to do it.
Mr. President, what did you mean?
Just one thing. What about
Don't underestimate that,
the possibility of the United States providing security guarantees to Ukraine?
Maybe. Along with Europe and other countries.
You would be
not in the form of NATO, because that's not going to, there are certain things that aren't going to happen. But, yeah, along with Europe, there's a possibility of that.
You mentioned the number of business people that President Putin is bringing along. Is that something that you want to discuss with President Putin at this meeting?
Yeah, if we make progress, I would discuss it, because that's one of the things that they would like. They'd like to get a piece of what I built in terms of the economy. Just so you know, we were a dead country with our economy. He wouldn't be interested. He wouldn't have been interested a year ago with the Biden economy. But he is interested in the Trump economy because we're doing. Wait till you see when those factories start opening up. We have hundreds of factories all over the country, and that includes auto factories, AI factories, and every other. They're all coming in because they want to beat the tariffs. Because if they open here, they don't have to pay tariffs. If they don't open here, they have to pay, in some cases, 200%, 300%. I haven't even set some of the tariffs yet. I'll be setting tariffs next week and the week after on steel and on, I would say, chips.
Steel higher than Mr. President?
Chips and semiconductors we'll be setting sometime next week after.
What rate are you looking at? What rate?
Well, I'm going to have a rate that is going to be lower at the beginning. Then that gives them a chance to come in and build, and very high after a certain period of time. And if they don't build here, they have to pay a very high tariff, which doesn't work, so they'll come and build.
Mr. President, you had said earlier.
Such a gentleman.
He did that with me.
Isn't he a gentleman? He's a nice.
He's helping me out.
He's a very nice. He's one of the few nice ones. Yes.
You had said earlier this week that Putin would face severe consequences if you get the sense from him
Yeah,
that he's not
very
interested. What do you mean by that?
Economically severe. Yes, it will be very severe. I'm not doing this for my health, okay? I don't need it. I'd like to focus on our country, but I'm doing this to save a lot of lives. Yeah, very severe. Thank you very much, everybody.
Listening to President Trump there aboard Air Force One as he was making his way here to Alaska and actually shedding some light on a comment he had made earlier to European allies and to Ukraine about severe consequences if there was not peace and Russia did not stop or at least have a ceasefire, saying those severe consequences would be economic. I want to bring in Michael Allen. He's a former senior director at the National Security Council and a majority staff director on the House Intel Committee. Thanks so much for joining our coverage. My first question to you is everything you've seen so far. How do you interpret some of the images we've seen and the world has seen and the president essentially showing his hand? He wants a ceasefire and he wants a second meeting.
Well, Tom, this is certainly the most important moment, I think, since the war broke out, certainly diplomatically. The security of Europe is at stake. Europe, of course, is where world wars are born. Ultimately, NATO and the United States interests are at stake here. On the one hand, I see President Trump raising expectations, saying he wants to get a ceasefire and even looking ahead to next meetings, but then on the other hand seeming to say it may not come together and I may have to revert to severe consequences. Where I think we are in the play today is that Vladimir Putin finally believes he's making some progress on the battlefield. I don't think President Trump has conditioned him to make real concessions. If we come out of here with a ceasefire today or in the near future, I'm not so sure Vladimir Putin will stick to it for very long, because I think essentially what he wants at the end of the day is for Ukraine not to exist. So I think that's one of the things that Trump is going to have to begin to manage through in these talks today.
I do want to ask you something. I know you probably don't know the answer to this, but they did announce that news conference pretty early. Do you think the president and the White House would have set that up, would have gone through with that, would have announced that to the world, unless they knew they had something to announce by the end of this summit?
I do feel like they know that they're going to have at least several little things that they're going to say. And even if fundamentally President Trump doesn't make progress with a recalcitrant Vladimir Putin, I feel like Trump is going to say this is the beginning of the process, not the end. We made progress just by sitting down and engaging in diplomacy. What's wrong with sitting down with some of your adversaries? So I think President Trump is going to be able to very likely spin this as a short-term success to justify going forward in the future. He's too invested just to have a one-and-done summit in Alaska. I think he's going to keep this going for a while.
Michael, great insight. We thank you for having you here on the broadcast. Garrett, I want to bring you in here. It just sort of struck me. I mean, they've put this together. The White House put this together. They announced that news conference. You got to think President Trump is not going to go out there and say, hey, no, we just couldn't come to terms, especially when both leaders are expected there.
Yeah, certainly if they're going to be standing side by side, I think they're going to have something to announce, a deliverable in the parlance of the White House.
But they want to announce something.
Right, even if the process has begun, whether it's an economic process or a peace process. I'll go back to the fact that you've got the Treasury and the Commerce secretaries here as well. If they want to look like they're, welcoming Russia back in some way, they've opened the door for future conversations. The president has said in the past he wants to restore an economic relationship with Russia. He doesn't think they should have been kicked out of the G8, for example. I don't know if that's on the table here today. But, he wants to have this be a more fulsome process with the Russians, not just about Ukraine. By the way, we know that's something that Vladimir Putin wants too. He doesn't want to talk about peace in Ukraine. All of our analysts have talked about this. He wants to talk about Russia getting back its place on the world stage.
And you were pointing out to me the ceasefire is going to be incredibly complicated because Putin has already set some terms, no NATO troops there, and who is the peacekeeping force?
Yeah, I mean, look, this idea of security guarantees and how a ceasefire gets held in place has been one of the open questions. President Trump has, not really answered about what he could make Russia give up in these talks. One of the things is how these security guarantees are enforced. The French, the British, to a lesser degree, the Germans have suggested it might be their forces, European forces, who are willing to be posted up in Ukraine as a security guarantee. There is almost a tripwire if Russia should invade again or violate a ceasefire. Putin doesn't want that. He's said as much. Could Trump force the issue on that today and call it a victory?
Still a lot of unknowns and still a lot that can happen tonight. Garrett, we thank you for all your coverage. That concludes this NBC News special report. We're going to have much more coverage ahead for President Trump and Vladimir Putin's joint press conference later this evening, and we'll have much more ahead on our streaming network, NBC News Now, online at NBCnews.com. I'm Tom Yamas, reporting live from Anchorage, Alaska. I'll see you tonight on Nightly News.